Good morning, Dad. I'm going to pick up chapter 39. This is a really short chapter this morning. I'm going to pick that up and try and get that one done. And then I'll be on the last chapter. So I want to get this all finished for you so you can listen to it all at your leisure. Chapter 39, Last Voyage. Last Voyage. Chapter 39. This is September 3rd through October 11th. Very short period, a little over a month. 1809. September 3rd to October 11th, 1809. The Mississippi River Valley in early September 1809 was hot, humid, buggy. Lewis's boat proceeded slowly since it was necessary for the crew to rest during the middle part of the day. He was in terrible condition, possibly suffering from a malaria attack, certainly in a deep depression that caused him unbearable pain. Twice he tried to kill himself. Whether by jumping overboard or with his pistol is not known, and had to be restrained by the crew. Ooh. On September 11th, he wrote his last will and testament. I bequeath all my estate, real and personal, to my mother, Lucy Marks, after my private debts are paid, of which a statement will be found in a small minute book deposited with Pernia, my servant. Lewis arrived at Chickasaw Bluffs, then the site of Fort Pickering, today the site of Memphis, Tennessee, on September 15th. Captain Gilbert Russell was the commander at the fort. On being informed of Lewis's suicide attempts, he resolved at once to take possession of him and his papers and detain them there until he recovered, or some friend might arrive into whose hands he could depart in safety. Lewis was drinking heavily, using snuff frequently, taking his pills, talking wildly, telling lies. He told Russell, as reported in the November 15, 1809 Washington Advertiser, that all the work on the journals had been completed and they were ready for the press. Apparently, that was his way of deflecting embarrassing questions about the project's progress. Russell deprived him of liquor, allowing him only a claret and a little white wine. The day after his arrival, Lewis wrote President Madison. The letter was garbled, although he managed to make his point. It needs to be quoted in full. I arrived here yesterday at about 2:00 p.m. Yesterday very much exhausted from the heat of the climate, but having taken medicine, feel much better this morning. My apprehension for the heat of the lower country and my fear of the original papers relative to my voyage to the Pacific Ocean falling into the hands of the British has induced me to change my route and proceed by land through the state of Tennessee to the city of Washington. I bring with me duplicates of my vouchers for public expenditures, etc., which, when fully explained, or rather the general view of the circumstances under which they were made, I flatter myself that they will receive both sanction and approbation and sanction. Provided my health permits, no time shall be lost in reaching Washington. My anxiety to pursue and to fulfill the duties incident to the internal arrangements incident to the government of Louisiana has prevented my writing you as more frequently. Mr. Bates is left in charge. Enclosed, I herewith transmit you a copy of the laws of the territory of Louisiana. I have the honor to be with the most sincere esteemed, your obedient and very humble servant. He repeats it twice. Over the following 5 days, Lewis showed no sign of improvement. Russell apparently had not deprived him of his medicines. Russell maintained a 24-hour suicide watch. Finally, Russell reported, on the 6th or 7th day, all symptoms of derangement disappeared and he was completely in his senses, although he was considerably reduced and debilitated. He was also ashamed of himself. Russell reported that he acknowledged very candidly to me after his recovery that he had been drinking to excess. Lewis said he was resolved never to drink any more spirits or use snuff again. Lewis set about straightening out his affairs. On September 22nd, he wrote his old friend Major Amos Stoddard, in command of Fort Adams, farther down the river. He began with an apology. I must acknowledge myself remiss in not writing you in answer to several friendly epistles which I have received from you since my return from the Pacific Ocean. He said he was on his way to Washington to explain his actions in St. Louis, which he hoped is all that is necessary to put all matters right. But his creditors were pressing him and had excessively embarrassed me. I hope you will therefore pardon me for asking you to remit as soon as is convenient the sum of $200 which you have informed me you hold for me. You will direct me to the city of Washington until the last of December, after which I expect I shall be on my return to St. Louis. Lewis asked Russell to accompany him to Washington, and Russell agreed. He too had some protested bills to explain to the new administration, but he could not get the leave of absence he had requested. Major James Neely, the U.S. agent for the Chickasaw Nation, had arrived at Fort Pickering on September 18th. He later wrote Jefferson that he found the governor in very bad health, but that during the week Lewis had recovered his health to some degree. On September 29th, Russell and Neely were satisfied that Lewis was capable of traveling overland to Washington, if accompanied by Pernier, Neely's servant. Lewis said he was ready to make the journey. Russell lent him $100 and sold him 2 horses on credit for the journey. Lewis signed a promissory note for $379.58, payable before January 1st, 1810, for the loan of the horses. Lewis had with him the journals, packed in trunks and carried by pack horse. The Natchez Trace seemed much safer to him than risking a sailboat from New Orleans to Washington, with British warships prowling the Atlantic coast, stopping American vessels and impressing American seamen into British service. What the British would give to have those journals, there was no danger of that on the Trace, which was the most heavily traveled road of the Old Southwest. The mail passed over it regularly. No robbery had been reported for years. There were inns along the way. It took the party 3 days to cover 100 miles. Along the way, Lewis repeatedly complained about his protested drafts. Pernier later reported to Clark that Lewis would frequently conceive that he heard me, Clark, coming on, and said that he was certain I would overtake him, that I had heard of his situation and would come to his relief. Lewis was drinking again. As Russell so heartbreakingly put it, his resolution never to drink again left him. Neely later reported to Jefferson that when they arrived at the Chickasaw Agency, some 6 miles north of present Houston, Mississippi, Lewis appeared at times deranged in mind. At Neely's insistence, the party stayed 2 days at the agency to rest. Lewis asked Neely, in the event that any accident happened to him, to send his trunks with the journals to the president, by whom Neely assumed Lewis meant Jefferson, not Madison. On October 6th, Lewis, Neely, and the servant set out again. On the morning of October 9th, they crossed the Tennessee River and camped near the present village of Collingwood, Tennessee. That night 2 of the horses strayed. In the morning, Neely said he would stay behind to find them. Lewis decided to proceed, Neely reported, with a promise to wait for me at the first house he came to that was inhabited with white people. Late in the afternoon, Lewis arrived at Grinder's Inn, 72 miles short of Nashville. It was a rough-hewn, poorly built log cabin that took in overnight customers. Mr. Grinder was away. Lewis requested accommodations for the night. "Are you alone?" Mrs. Grinder asked. No, Lewis replied. 2 servants would be coming along shortly. Mrs. Grinder said that they would be welcome. Lewis dismounted, unsaddled his horse, and brought the saddle in the house. He was dressed in a loose gown, white striped with blue. He asked for some whiskey, which he drank but a little. When Pernier and the other servant arrived, Lewis asked for his gunpowder, saying he was sure he had some in the canister. Pernier gave no distinct reply, probably because he had been told by Neely to keep the powder away from Lewis. Lewis began pacing in front of the cabin. Mrs. Grinder later reported that sometimes he would seem as if he were walking up to her and would suddenly wheel around and walk back as fast as he could. She prepared a meal. Lewis entered the cabin and sat at the table, but after only a few mouthfuls he started up, speaking to himself in a very violent manner. Mrs. Grinder noted that his face was flushed, as if it had come on him in a fit. Lewis lit his pipe, drew a chair to the door, sat down, and remarked to Mrs. Grinder in a kindly tone, "Madam, this is a very pleasant evening." After finishing his pipe, he rose and paced the yard. He sat again, lit another pipe, seemed composed. He cast his eyes wishfully toward the west. He spoke again of what a sweet evening it was. As he sat on Mrs. Grinder's porch looking west while the light faded from the sky, what were his thoughts? Were they of the rivers, the Missouri and the Columbia and the others? Did he recall the Arikaras, the Sioux, the Mandans? Did he think of the first time he had seen Sacagawea? Did he remember the April day in 1805 when he started out from the Mandan Nation on his darling project, daring to link his name with Columbus and Captain Cook? Did he dwell on the decision at the Marias? Or were the plants, animals, birds, scenery of the Garden of Eden he had passed through commanding his imagination? If so, surely he thought of cottonwoods, prickly pears, the gigantic trees of the Pacific Ocean, of grouse and woodpeckers and condors, of the grizzlies and of the unbelievable buffalo herds, the pronghorns, sheep, coyotes, prairie dogs, and the other animals he had discovered and described, of those remarkable white cliffs along the Missouri and the gates of the Rocky Mountains, the Columbia Gorge. Did Three Forks, that essential spot in the geography of the West, spring to his mind? Or was it Kameawait and the Shoshones? Perhaps it was Old Toby and that terrible trip across the Bitterroots. Did he recall the Nez Perce and their fabulous ponies and generosity, or the journey down the western waters to the sea? Or was it his Christmas and New Year's dinners of water and lean elk at Fort Clatsop? It may be that he thought of the long waiting period with the Nez Perce, and the one time he had been forced to turn back in the first attempt to force the Bitterroots in the spring of 1806. Or was it the Blackfeet and the only Indian fight of his life? Or the time he got shot in the ass? Did he do a roll call of his men? If so, there was a special place for drill yard. If he thought of the men, surely he thought of his co-commander, the best friend any man ever had. He had told Pernier earlier that day that General Clark had heard of his difficulties and was coming on. As the light faded, was he looking westward toward the trace, expecting to see Clark ride in to set everything right? Did one of Mrs. Grinder's dogs chase a squirrel and remind him of Seaman? Could it be that he thought of that moment of triumph when his canoes put in at St. Louis in September 1806? Or were his thoughts gloomy? Were they about his unsolvable problems? Did he agonize over his speculations and the financial ruins that they had brought him to? Was that awful Secretary Bates foremost in his thoughts? Did he wonder why he had failed in his courtships and had no wife? Did he curse himself for his drinking? Did his mind dwell on Thomas Jefferson? Was he ashamed of how he had failed the man he adored? Did he think of the journals over in the corner in his saddlebags? Or did his mind avoid the past? Was he rehearsing what he would say to Secretary Eustis and President Madison? Or was his yearning for more pills or more whiskey? We cannot know. We only know that he was tortured, that his pain was unbearable. Mrs. Grinder began to prepare a bed for him, but he stopped her and said he would sleep on the floor, explaining that since his journey to the Pacific, he could no longer sleep on a feather bed. He had Pernier bring in his bearskins and buffalo robe and spread them on the floor. While Pernier was getting the bedding, Lewis found some powder. Mrs. Grinder went to the kitchen to sleep, and the servants went to the barn of some 200 yards distant. Lewis began pacing in his room. He went on for several hours. Mrs. Grinder, who was frightened and could not sleep, heard him talking aloud, like a lawyer. Lewis got out his pistols, loaded them, and at some time during the early hours of October 11th, shot himself in the head. The ball only grazed his skull. He fell heavily on the floor. Mrs. Grinder heard him exclaim, "Oh, Lord!" Lewis rose, took up his other pistol, and shot himself in his breast. The ball entered and passed through his body to emerge low down on his backbone. He survived the second shot, staggered to the door of his room, and called out, "Oh, Madame, give me some water and heal my wounds." Lewis staggered outside, fell, crawled for some distance, raised himself by the side of a tree, then staggered back to his room. He scraped the bucket with the gourd for water, but the bucket was empty. He collapsed on his robes. At first sight, the terrified Mrs. Grinder sent her children to fetch the servants. When they got to Lewis's room, they found him busily engaged in cutting himself from head to foot with his razor. Lewis saw Pernier and said to him, "I have done the business, my good servant. Give me some water." And Pernier did. Lewis uncovered his side and showed them the second wound. He said, "I am no coward, but I am so strong it is so hard to die." He said he had tried to kill himself to deprive his enemies of the pleasure and honor of doing it. He begged the servants to take his rifle and blow out his brains, telling them not to be afraid, for he would not hurt them, and they could have all the money in his trunk. Shortly after sunrise, his great heart stopped beating. That's the end of chapter 39. Chapter 40, the last chapter, the aftermath. I'll read that a little bit later. I think I'm down to one final reading. Yes, I'm down to one final reading. It's about 7 pages, so I should be able to get that one done in short order. I had kind of read into chapter 39. Honestly, Dad, I don't know that I've ever been told that Lewis had committed suicide. I don't ever remember hearing that. So this is something that's very new to me, and it kind of speaks. Well, I'll put it in this perspective. I find myself engaged with a couple of people in conversation about the person of Santa and how we draw people to us. And that's true, we do. Some men are very egregious, they are very outgoing, and I'm not. I'm kind of a little more of a quiet person, and I allow people to come to me, and I try and bless them that way. But some guys will enter a room with great fanfare and loud voice, and I'm just not that way. And my point of this is that I heard somebody say recently to me that there's a lot of Santas out there that are very egotistical, and I really pray that I never come across that way, but it's possible I do. The lady who said it to me was commenting at the time about how she found me to be so peaceable and amiable. She is the woman who is her husband used to be a Santa back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and is very well known across the country as being an early model of the Santa that we have today. She resides down in Santa Claus, Indiana, where I just had my book signing. And so it was kind of an interesting conversation, some of the things that she said. I don't know. I look at what happened with Lewis, and I can really understand, and I don't know that I can identify with him, but I can understand his situation where he had come back such a vaunted hero, and yet when all the excitement drew down, he didn't know what to do with himself. He knew that he had just done something that was quite phenomenal, and yet I look at people like Neil Armstrong, and I am very amazed at how he seemed to be able to govern his ego, his arrogance after he returned from the moon. So, it's just ego is one of those things that, as humans, they can easily overtake us, as must have happened with Lewis. He didn't know how to live if he wasn't constantly having all this adulation thrust at him. I don't know. I just find it very interesting how Ambrose talks about his how he became so accomplished at such a young age, and then when all the furor died down, he didn't know how to handle himself, and I find that very sad indeed. Anyhow, for what it's worth, I'm just really enjoying this story. I'm very anxious to finish up the last chapter for you. So I'll leave it at that. This is a short chapter today, and I'll try and get 40 done within the next day or so, because I am so close to having it all finished up. So I love you, Dad. I'll talk to you later.